The night sky over the Balkans was moonless and thick with cloud cover when Marcus Hale felt the static line tug hard against his harness. The jump light turned green, and he was gone, swallowed by the darkness, free-falling through cold air that bit at his face and hands. He counted seconds in his head, old muscle memory from years in the Corps, and pulled the chute at exactly the right moment. The canopy snapped open above him with a violent jerk, and suddenly the world went quiet, except for the whisper of wind through nylon and the distant rumble of thunder rolling across the mountains. He was 43 years old, a decade removed from active duty, but his body still remembered how to land. The forest floor came up fast. Uneven terrain, scattered rocks, dense underbrush. He hit hard, rolled with the impact, and came up on one knee with his rifle already in hand. The parachute collapsed behind him in a tangle of white silk that he quickly gathered and shoved into a shallow depression beneath a fallen tree. No time for proper burial. He was 7 miles behind enemy lines, and every second counted. The mission brief had been clear: infiltrate, observe, report. Intelligence suggested a buildup of forces in this region, but satellite imagery was inconclusive due to weather and heavy canopy. Command needed eyes on the ground, someone who could move unseen and relay real-time information. Marcus had done this kind of work before, back when he wore the uniform every day. Now he did it as a contractor, no fanfare, no glory, just the work itself, and a paycheck that helped him forget why he'd left in the first place. The reasons for leaving still followed him, though. Late nights when sleep wouldn't come, and he'd stare at the ceiling of his apartment in Virginia, hearing echoes of voices from men who hadn't made it home. The Corps had been his life for 20 years. Boot camp at Parris Island when he was barely 18. Deployments to every hotspot the government needed Marines. Promotions that came with more responsibility and less sleep. He'd been good at it, maybe too good, because they kept sending him back. Iraq 3 times, Afghanistan twice, smaller operations in places that never made the news. Each tour took something from him, small pieces he didn't notice missing, until he looked in the mirror one day and didn't recognize the man staring back. His ex-wife had tried to understand, but how could she? She'd married a motivated young sergeant and ended up with a lieutenant colonel who was present in body but absent in every way that mattered. The divorce papers came while he was on his 4th deployment, and he'd signed them in a plywood hut that smelled like diesel and sweat, feeling nothing but a vague sense of relief that she'd finally stopped waiting for someone who'd never really come home. His daughter was 16 now, living in California with her mother, and a stepfather who coached Little League and worked in insurance. She called sometimes, awkward conversations where neither of them knew what to say. He sent money, birthday cards, tried to be something other than the ghost of a father, but the distance between them was measured in more than miles. So when the contracting offer came, good pay, short duration, used the skills he'd spent 2 decades building, he'd taken it without much thought. At least out here, in the woods and the dark, he knew his purpose. At least out here, the mission was clear. He moved through the forest with practiced silence, boots finding solid ground between the leaves and branches. The trees here were old growth, thick trunks and heavy canopy that blocked what little light the clouded sky provided. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and somewhere in the distance he could hear water running over rocks. Good. Water meant he could refill his canteens without using purification tablets that left everything tasting like chemicals. He marked the sound's direction mentally and continued toward his primary objective. The radio on his chest rig was a PRC-152, military grade, encrypted, supposedly waterproof. He checked it 3 times before the jump, running through all the frequencies, confirming the encryption keys, making sure the battery was fully charged. It was his lifeline, the invisible thread that connected him to the operations center 200 miles away, where analysts sat in air-conditioned rooms and watched screens full of data. Without it, he was a ghost. With it, he was an asset, valuable, mission-critical. The difference mattered. By dawn, he'd covered 3 miles and found a concealed position on a ridgeline overlooking a valley. The rain had stopped sometime during the night, leaving everything wet and dripping. Through his binoculars, as the gray light of morning slowly revealed the landscape below, he saw what command needed to know. Trucks, dozens of them, parked in neat rows beneath camouflage netting. Artillery pieces being positioned along the valley floor, their barrels still covered but their crews already at work. Soldiers setting up defensive positions, digging trenches, stringing wire. This wasn't a minor patrol or a temporary encampment. This was preparation for something big, something that required logistics and planning, and the kind of resources that meant someone high up the chain of command had made serious decisions. Marcus pulled out his notebook, old-fashioned paper because batteries died and screens cracked, but pencil on paper was forever, and began sketching what he saw. Vehicle types, numbers, positions, artillery caliber based on the size of the pieces, troop estimates based on the number of tents and cooking fires. He worked methodically, the way he'd been trained, reducing chaos to data points that could be analyzed and acted upon. When he finished, he had 3 pages of notes that told a story. An offensive was being prepared, something large enough to require serious countermeasures. He pulled the radio from his pack, extended the antenna, and pressed the transmit button. Static. He adjusted the frequency, tried again. More static, then a faint crackle that might have been a voice, but it dissolved into white noise before he could make out words. He checked the connections, the battery, the settings. Everything looked good. He tried different frequencies, cycling through the preset channels, then manual tuning across the entire band. Nothing but static, sometimes loud, sometimes soft, but never resolving into anything coherent. Then the rain started again. It came suddenly, the way mountain storms do, a wall of water that turned the world gray and reduced visibility to a few meters. Marcus hunched over the radio, trying to shield it with his body, but within minutes everything was soaked. His jacket was supposedly waterproof, but water always found a way, down the neck, up the sleeves, through seams that weren't quite sealed. He kept trying, cycling through frequencies, adjusting the squelch, pressing the transmit button and speaking into the handset even though he knew nobody was hearing him. When he finally pulled the radio apart to inspect it, he found water inside the battery compartment, small droplets clinging to the contacts, condensation on the circuit boards. The seals had failed, probably damaged during the jump, a tiny flaw that had just become catastrophic. For a long moment, he just sat there in the rain, water running down his face, staring at the useless piece of equipment in his hands. He'd been in bad situations before, plenty of them, but always with communication. Always with the knowledge that if things went completely sideways, he could call for help, call for extraction, call for fire support. The radio was more than just equipment. It was the difference between being a soldier and being abandoned. No communication meant no intel relay. No intel relay meant the mission was compromised. The information in his notebook, information that could save lives and prevent whatever offensive was being planned in that valley, was worthless if it never reached the people who could act on it, and no extraction would come if he couldn't call for it. The insertion had been one way, with exfil contingent on him reaching a pickup point and confirming via radio. Without the radio, nobody was coming. He was alone in hostile territory with information that could change the course of operations, and no way to share it. He thought about trying to move back to the drop zone, see if he could reach friendly lines on foot. He pulled out his map, studied the terrain, calculated distances and routes. 7 miles to the drop zone, then another 40 to 50 miles across mountains to reach friendly positions, assuming he didn't run into enemy patrols or natural obstacles that forced detours. 3 days minimum, more likely 5, traveling at night and hiding during the day. By then, whatever was being planned in that valley would already be in motion. Convoys would have moved, artillery would have been deployed, soldiers would have advanced. People would die because he couldn't get a message through in time. The thought settled in his chest like a stone, heavy and cold. Then he remembered the flares. Every survival kit carried them. Signal flares in 3 colors. Red for danger, green for all clear, white for general distress. They were backup, last resort tools, meant for situations exactly like this, when all the high-tech equipment failed and you were down to the basics of fire and light. But flares were visible for miles in every direction, and firing one would announce his presence to anyone looking. Every enemy soldier in the area would know someone was out there, and they'd come looking. Still, what choice did he have? Intelligence was worthless if it never reached the people who needed it, and sitting here doing nothing while an offensive prepared was its own kind of failure. He spent the rest of the day observing, adding more notes, sketching more details. The rain continued on and off, sometimes heavy downpours that obscured everything, sometimes light drizzle that just made the world gray and miserable. He ate a cold meal from his pack, energy bars and dried fruit, washed down with water from his canteen, and thought about his daughter. She'd be in school right now, math class maybe, or English. Did she think about him? Did she wonder where he was, what he was doing? Probably not. He'd been absent more than present for most of her life, and absence became normal after a while. People adapted, filled the empty spaces with other things, other people. Life went on without you. He waited until dusk, when visibility would be limited but not completely gone. The sun was setting somewhere behind the clouds, turning the gray sky briefly orange and pink before fading to darker gray and then black. From his position on the ridgeline, he could see across the valley and beyond, where he knew friendly forces were positioned based on the mission brief. A forward operating base, NATO troops, air support available. If anyone was watching, if any aircraft were in the area conducting patrols they might see. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was all he had. He pulled the red flare from his kit, a tube about 8 inches long and 2 inches in diameter, with instructions printed on the side that he didn't need to read. He'd used flares before, training exercises mostly, once for real during a nighttime maritime operation when his boat had engine trouble. Point it away from yourself and anyone else. Pull the trigger cap. Stand clear of the exhaust. He pointed it skyward, away from the trees that might catch the sparks, and fired. The flare shot up with a hiss and a trail of smoke, bursting into brilliant crimson light about 200 feet above the ground. For 30 seconds, the entire valley was painted red, shadows sharp and dramatic, every detail visible in the artificial daylight. Then the flare died, tumbling back to earth, and darkness returned so completely that Marcus's eyes needed several seconds to adjust. He moved immediately, relocating half a mile to the north. Basic field craft. Never stay in one position after revealing yourself. If anyone had seen the flare, they'd come looking at the launch point, and he needed to be somewhere else when they arrived. He found a new hide among the rocks, a jumble of boulders that created a small cave-like space, and settled in to wait. His shoulder ached from the pack's weight, and his knees weren't what they used to be, reminding him with small twinges that he wasn't 25 anymore, getting old in a young man's profession. But experience counted for something, and right now his experience was the only thing keeping him alive. An hour passed, then another. The night settled in fully, temperature dropping, the kind of cold that seeped through wet clothes and made your bones ache. Marcus pulled his jacket tighter and wished he could risk a small fire, just enough to dry out and warm up. But fires were visible and fires made smoke and both would draw attention. So he sat in the cold and the dark and waited. Then he heard it, the faint, distant hum of an engine. High altitude, jet engine probably, too far away to identify the aircraft type. Could be anything. Commercial flight passing overhead. Cargo plane on a routine run. But then the sound shifted, grew slightly louder, and through the clouds he saw navigation lights moving across the sky. The aircraft changed course, a subtle shift that brought it closer to his position, made a slow pass over the valley, then continued on. Marcus watched until the lights disappeared and the sound faded, and allowed himself a small moment of hope. Something had responded to his signal. Whether they understood what it meant, whether they'd do anything about it, he didn't know. But someone had seen. Over the next 2 days, Marcus developed a system. He studied the old field manual he carried, the one that had been issued to him during basic training decades ago, and that he'd kept through multiple deployments because it contained information that didn't change. Before radios, before satellites, before all the digital communication systems that made modern warfare possible, soldiers had used signals, fires, mirrors, flags, flares. The manual outlined basic codes, simple systems that anyone could learn. Flare colors could mean different things depending on context. Red typically meant danger or enemy contact. Green meant safe or friendly. White was general distress. But patterns could convey more information: timing, spacing, repetition. He began experimenting, firing flares in sequences, waiting for responses. The first night, he fired 2 red flares 10 seconds apart, trying to communicate that the danger was urgent, immediate. An hour later, he saw lights in the sky again. Same aircraft or a different one. He couldn't tell. The second night, he tried a different pattern. Red flare. Wait 60 seconds. Another red flare. Wait 60 seconds. A third red flare. 3 points of danger. 3 separate concerns. This time, the response came faster. Multiple aircraft, flying lower, clearly searching for something. They didn't find him, but they were looking. Communication was happening, crude and imprecise, but real. He mapped the enemy positions as best he could, marking locations in his notebook with grid coordinates derived from terrain features and his GPS unit, which still worked. The GPS was receive only, pulling data from satellites but not transmitting anything, so it couldn't be tracked. He marked each artillery position, each vehicle concentration, each troop encampment. Then he tried to figure out how to communicate those positions using nothing but colored lights in the sky. The challenge was precision. A red flare said, "Danger here," but here was wherever the flare was launched from. How could he indicate danger somewhere else a mile away? 2 miles away? He needed a reference system, something that would let him point to specific locations without being at those locations. The solution came from orienteering, from the basic map and compass skills every Marine learned. If he could establish a baseline, a known point, he could indicate other points relative to it. His position became north. Flares fired in quick succession could indicate direction and distance. It was imperfect, required interpretation on the other end, but it might work. Each night, he would move to a new location and fire a series of flares, red for enemy positions, space to indicate different locations, followed by white to emphasize urgency. He'd fire from high points when possible, giving the flares maximum visibility and altitude. Sometimes aircraft would appear within minutes. Sometimes nothing came for hours. But slowly, a dialogue emerged. He couldn't hear the other side, couldn't know if his messages were understood, but he had to believe someone was watching. Someone was trying to understand. The alternative, that he was sending signals into empty void, that nobody cared or noticed, was too bleak to consider. The enemy knew someone was out there now. Patrols increased dramatically. He saw search parties moving through the forest, systematic sweeps with dogs and thermal imaging equipment. They knew the flares were coming from inside their perimeter, and they were determined to find the source. Marcus stayed ahead of them, never sleeping in the same place twice, moving in patterns designed to confuse trackers. He doubled back on his own trail, walked through streams to break his scent, climbed rocks to avoid leaving footprints. He ate cold rations, drank from streams after treating the water with purification tablets, and tried not to think about how much longer he could keep this up. His body was breaking down in small ways. Blisters on his feet from wet boots that never dried. A persistent cough from the cold and damp. Muscles that ached constantly from carrying the pack and sleeping on hard ground. He was in good shape for his age, ran regularly, lifted weights. But this was different. This was sustained stress, physical and mental, with no respite. Every night was the same. Observe, move, signal, hide. Every day was the same. Hide, observe, move, hide again. The repetition became almost meditative, a ritual that gave structure to chaos. On the 4th night, he found what he'd been looking for, a hidden command post tucked into a ravine about 2 miles from his current position. He almost missed it. Would have missed it if he hadn't been in exactly the right spot at exactly the right time. He'd been moving along a ridgeline when he noticed unusual radio antenna arrays, the kind used for command and control communications. Following the antenna lines with his binoculars, he spotted the camouflage netting, expertly placed to blend with the natural terrain. Beneath the netting, he could see vehicles, generators, soldiers who moved with the purposeful efficiency of people with important jobs. This was the nerve center, the place where decisions were being made, where the officers planned and the communications equipment connected this valley to higher headquarters. If command knew this location, they could disrupt the entire operation. One well-placed airstrike could decapitate the enemy's ability to coordinate their offensive. But how could he communicate something so specific with colored lights in the sky? He couldn't just fire a flare over the command post. That would require him to be right on top of it, which was suicide. He needed a way to point from his position to their position, to say, not here, but there, 2 miles southeast. This is what matters. He spent an hour working it out, using his map and compass to calculate angles and distances. He would fire flares in a pattern that formed a grid, each flare representing a coordinate point relative to his position. It was crude, required the people on the other end to be paying very close attention and making correct assumptions about what the pattern meant, but it might work. He waited until the early hours of the morning, around 3 a.m., when enemy activity was lowest and the sky was clearest. The clouds had finally broken up, revealing stars that seemed impossibly bright after so many days of gray overcast. He had 6 flares left, 3 red, 2 green, 1 white. He'd use the red ones for this, saving the others for emergencies. He climbed to the highest point he could safely reach, a rocky outcrop that gave him clear line of sight in multiple directions. Then he began. First red flare, fired to the north, bursting at about 200 feet. He counted to 30, letting the flare die completely, letting the darkness return. Second red flare, fired to the northeast, same altitude. Count to 30. Third red flare, fired to the east. Each flare marked a point on an imaginary grid, and together they triangulated the location of the command post. At least, that's what he hoped someone watching would understand. That these 3 points weren't random, weren't just general warnings, but specific coordinates forming a pattern that pointed to a precise location. He moved immediately after the last flare died, knowing he'd just painted a massive target on himself. 6 flares in 4 days. The enemy would have analysts trying to predict his patterns, trying to guess where he'd be next. He climbed down from the outcrop and ran, really ran for the first time since landing, pushing his body to cover distance quickly. He ran for 20 minutes, until his lungs burned and his legs threatened to give out, then found a hiding spot in dense undergrowth and went completely still. Hours later, as dawn broke and the sky turned from black to gray to pale blue, he heard the jets. High altitude, supersonic, the sound arriving seconds after the contrails appeared. He counted them, 4, no 5, flying in formation. Then they were gone, vanished beyond the mountains, and for a moment nothing happened. Then the valley erupted. Explosions walked across the landscape in precise intervals, striking with devastating accuracy. Marcus watched through his binoculars as the hillside where the command post was hidden disappeared in fireballs. 1 strike, 2, 3, 4, each one perfectly placed, no wasted ordnance, no random destruction. Secondary explosions followed as ammunition and fuel stores ignited. Through the binoculars he could see the camouflage netting burning, vehicles reduced to twisted metal, soldiers running in panic. The command post he'd marked, the nerve center of whatever operation was being planned, no longer existed. The strikes continued, expanding outward from the initial target. Artillery positions he'd marked over the previous days were hit. Vehicle concentrations disappeared in flames. The entire valley became a scene of controlled devastation, each explosion precisely targeted, each strike part of a coordinated plan. Someone had understood his messages. Someone had taken his crude flare signals and turned them into actionable intelligence, and now that intelligence was being converted into kinetic energy, delivered from 30,000 feet at supersonic speeds. Marcus allowed himself a moment of satisfaction, a brief acknowledgement that he'd accomplished the mission despite every obstacle. Then reality reasserted itself. The enemy forces, now fully alert and furious, began an intensive search. He heard helicopters, saw them flying grid patterns over the forest, heard vehicles moving on nearby roads, troops being deployed. They knew someone had directed those strikes, someone with eyes on their positions, and they were determined to find that someone. He was forced to move constantly, abandoning cover, taking risks he normally wouldn't. Twice he was nearly spotted by patrol helicopters, saved only by dense canopy that hid him from aerial observation. Once he had to lie perfectly still while a foot patrol passed within 10 meters. Soldiers so close he could hear their conversation, complaints about the cold and the mission, and officers who sent them into the forest to chase ghosts. He held his breath until they passed, then waited another 30 minutes before moving. The second time he was spotted, he wasn't as lucky. He'd been crossing a small clearing, thinking it was clear when automatic weapons fire erupted from the tree line. He felt the impacts before he heard the shots, the strange physics of supersonic bullets arriving before their sound. Something hit his left shoulder, a hammer blow that spun him around and sent him sprawling. He rolled, came up firing his rifle one-handed, emptying half a magazine in the direction of the muzzle flashes. Then he was up and running, or trying to run, his left arm useless and his shoulder on fire with pain. He scrambled up a rocky slope, using his good arm to pull himself over obstacles, bullets sparking off rocks around him. At the top of the slope, he found a jumble of boulders that provided some cover and dove into it, breathing hard, trying to assess the damage. Blood soaked through his jacket, warm and sticky. He couldn't feel his left arm below the elbow, just a distant tingling that probably meant nerve damage. With his right hand, he managed to pull out his medical kit, get it open. The wound was in his shoulder, high up near the joint. He couldn't see it properly, couldn't reach it to bandage it effectively. He packed gauze against it as best he could, used his teeth to help tie the bandage tight, cinching it until the pain made him gasp. The bleeding slowed but didn't stop completely. He found shelter in a small cave, really just an overhang of rock that created a space barely large enough for one person, and tried to think through the fog of pain and shock. The wound was bad, but probably not fatal if he could avoid infection and blood loss. The bullet had passed through muscle. He was pretty sure of that. If it had hit bone or an artery, he'd already be dead or dying. But his left arm was mostly useless now, hanging limp and heavy at his side. More concerning was the fever he could feel building, the flush of heat that meant his body was fighting something. Infection, probably. The bullet had carried fabric from his jacket into the wound, bacteria from the environment, maybe fragments of the bullet itself. He had antibiotics in his medical kit, broad-spectrum capsules meant for exactly this situation. He dry swallowed 4 of them, twice the normal dose, and drank half his remaining water. Then he allowed himself to rest, just for a moment, just long enough to let the immediate crisis pass. But the moment stretched, and he felt himself slipping toward unconsciousness, the pain and exhaustion finally overwhelming his ability to stay alert. He forced his eyes open, slapped his own face with his good hand, the sharp sting of it shocking his system back to awareness. Sleep now meant dying. He had to stay awake, had to stay moving. That night, through the haze of fever and pain, he saw aircraft again. Friendly forces, he was sure of it. The silhouettes matched models he recognized. Apache helicopters, probably on patrol, searching for targets. But they were too far away, searching in the wrong sector. He had 3 flares left in his kit, 2 green, 1 white. The green flares were for signaling friendly forces, for saying, "I'm here, I'm one of you, don't shoot." He pulled one out, hands shaking from fever and weakness, and fired it into the sky. The green star burst overhead, brilliant against the darkness, visible for miles. The helicopters circled once, their searchlights sweeping the forest, and for a moment, Marcus felt hope surge through him. They'd seen the flare, they were coming. Extraction was finally happening. Then the helicopters turned away and disappeared over the mountains, their lights fading, their sound receding to nothing. They hadn't seen him, or they had and couldn't risk an extraction in such hostile territory. Or maybe they'd seen the flare and assumed it was an enemy trick, a trap designed to lure them in. Whatever the reason, they were gone, and he was still alone. He collapsed against the rock wall of his small shelter, feeling the weight of despair pressing down harder than exhaustion. He'd done everything right, accomplished the mission, provided intelligence that had changed the tactical situation, and it didn't matter. He was going to die out here slowly, from infection or blood loss or exposure, and nobody would ever know. Just another contractor who disappeared on a mission, name redacted from official reports, family notified by letter that expressed regret and provided no details. He thought about his daughter again, wondered what she'd think when she heard. Would she cry? Would she feel anything at all? Or had he been absent so long that his death would be just another piece of bad news, filed away with all the other disappointments? He'd wanted to be a good father, had tried in his own inadequate way, but the job always came first. The mission, the core, the nebulous concept of duty that justified every absence and broken promise. And where had it gotten him? A dying man in a cave in the Balkans, alone, forgotten, running out of time. But Marcus Hale hadn't survived 2 tours in Iraq and 1 in Afghanistan by giving up when things looked hopeless. He'd survived by being stubborn, by refusing to accept defeat even when defeat seemed inevitable. He pulled himself together, forced his mind to focus through the fever. The radio was dead, but he had other equipment, wire from his kit, the kind used for field repairs and improvised solutions. A battery pack from the broken radio, still holding a charge. His tactical flashlight, LED bulb, rated for thousands of hours. If he couldn't send colored lights into the sky, maybe he could send a signal that wouldn't fade. A beacon, something continuous, something that would keep broadcasting his position all night long. He spent the next hour, working slowly because every movement hurt and his hands wouldn't stop shaking, stripping wire and connecting circuits. He wasn't an electrician, wasn't an engineer, but he'd worked with enough equipment over the years to understand the basics. Connect the battery to the flashlight, but not directly. Run the connection through a small circuit he built from components scavenged from other equipment, creating a timer that would turn the light on and off in regular intervals. A strobe effect, like a lighthouse, visible for miles in the darkness. The work kept him focused, kept him from sliding into fever dreams. When he finished, he tested the circuit. The flashlight pulsed on and off, steady rhythm, 1 second on, 2 seconds off, over and over. It wasn't sophisticated, wasn't elegant, but it would work. He set it up on the highest point he could reach without being completely exposed, a rocky outcrop about 50 meters from his hiding spot. Then he activated the makeshift beacon and retreated to cover, watching the rhythmic flash cut through the night. Every pulse was a message. I'm here, I'm alive, come get me. It was also a beacon for the enemy, and he knew they would come. This was his last stand, the final gambit. Either rescue arrived before the enemy did, or he'd make his end here, among these rocks and trees, as far from home as it was possible to be. They arrived before dawn, a patrol of 8 soldiers moving in tactical formation. Marcus saw them coming from his hiding spot, shadows against shadows, and knew immediately he was outnumbered and outgunned. He had 3 magazines left for his rifle, 90 rounds total, and a sidearm with 1 full magazine, 15 rounds. Not enough for a prolonged firefight, not enough to win against trained soldiers who had all the advantages, but enough to make noise, to buy time, to hope that someone heard and sent help. He let them get close, waited until they were committed to their approach, then opened fire from concealment. The point man went down immediately, taking 3 rounds to center mass. The others scattered, professional and fast, returning fire that chewed through the vegetation and sparked off rocks. Marcus moved after each burst, never staying in one position, using every trick he'd ever learned about fighting from cover. Fire and move. Never shoot from the same spot twice. Make them guess. Make them waste ammunition. Make them afraid. The firefight lasted 10 minutes that felt like hours. His world narrowed to trigger pulls and sight pictures, to counting rounds and calculating angles. When his rifle ran dry, he switched to the pistol, shooting one-handed because his left arm still wouldn't work. When the pistol's slide locked back empty, he threw rocks, anything to keep the enemy's heads down, to buy another few seconds. One soldier tried to flank him, and Marcus met him with a knife, close-quarters desperation that left them both bleeding. The soldier went down, and Marcus took his rifle, a weapon he didn't recognize, but that functioned well enough. The enemy pulled back, regrouping, probably calling for reinforcements. Marcus knew he had minutes at most. He was bleeding again. The shoulder wound reopened and new injuries added to the list. A graze across his ribs that burned like fire. A gash on his forehead from flying rock fragments that sent blood running into his eyes. His ammunition was gone. His body was failing. And the sky was beginning to lighten with approaching dawn. This was how it ended, he thought. Not with honor or glory, but with exhaustion and inevitability, worn down by sheer attrition until there was nothing left. Then he heard it, faint at first, almost lost in the ringing of his ears from gunfire, but growing steadily louder. The distinctive thump-thump-thump of rotor blades, the most beautiful sound in the world. A helicopter, flying low and fast, coming from the west. Marcus looked up, wiping blood from his eyes, and saw it crest the ridgeline. A Black Hawk, U.S. Army markings, door gunners, visible on both sides. The aircraft didn't slow, didn't hesitate. It dropped into the valley, flaring hard just above the ground, and 2 things happened simultaneously. The door gunners opened up on the enemy soldiers, suppressing them with withering fire, and 2 soldiers in full combat gear jumped out and ran toward Marcus's position. They reached him in seconds, grabbed him under the arms, hauled him to his feet. He tried to help, tried to run, but his legs wouldn't cooperate properly, wouldn't support his weight. Everything was noise and motion and pain, the world tilting and spinning as they dragged him across broken ground toward the helicopter. 50 meters, then 40, then 30, and bullets cracked past, tracers reaching up from enemy positions that hadn't been suppressed. The door gunner on the left side swung his weapon around, engaging targets Marcus couldn't see. 20 meters, then 10. They threw him into the cabin, not gently but effectively, and jumped in after him. The Black Hawk lifted off immediately, banking hard, engines screaming as the pilot pushed for altitude and distance. Marcus felt hands on him, a medic cutting away his jacket, pressing fresh bandages against wounds, starting an IV line. Someone was talking to him, asking questions. What's your name? What's your unit? Stay with us. Stay awake. But he couldn't focus on the words. The helicopter shuddered as something impacted the fuselage. Small arms fire, probably. Not enough to bring them down, but enough to remind everyone they weren't safe yet. Through the open door, Marcus watched the landscape fall away. The valley where he'd spent a week in hell, the mountains that had nearly become his grave, the forest that had hidden him and tried to kill him. Below, fires burned where his signals had directed ordnance. Smoke rose from destroyed positions, and even from this altitude he could see the chaos his intelligence had caused. Vehicles abandoned, troops scattered, defensive positions in disarray. Intelligence reports would later confirm that the strikes had disrupted a major offensive, destroyed critical supply lines, eliminated key command personnel, and delayed enemy operations by weeks, if not months. The war hadn't ended, but its trajectory had shifted because one man refused to let a dead radio be the end of his mission. Marcus came to in a field hospital, clean sheets and bright lights and the smell of antiseptic that meant safety and civilization and the end of immediate danger. His shoulder was properly bandaged. IV lines ran into his arm, and he could feel the warm fog of pain medication making everything soft around the edges. A doctor told him he'd been lucky. The infection had been caught in time. No permanent damage to major structures. He'd heal completely with rest and physical therapy. 6 weeks minimum before he'd have full range of motion back. Longer before he'd be cleared for any kind of field work, but he'd recover. The doctor spoke with the casual confidence of someone who dealt with gunshot wounds regularly. Just another damaged soldier passing through. Nothing unusual or remarkable. An officer came by later, a colonel with intelligence insignia, asked him questions about what he'd seen, took detailed notes in a leather-bound notebook. Marcus told him everything. The patrol patterns, the vehicle types, the troop numbers, the location of the command post. The colonel nodded, asked clarifying questions, seemed satisfied with the answers. At the end, he thanked Marcus for his service, said the intelligence had been crucial, said people at very high levels were pleased with the mission outcome. He didn't specify which people or which levels, but Marcus understood. The thanks were genuine even if the details were vague. That was how the secret world worked. Lots of impact, very little recognition. They gave him a medal eventually, a ceremony with handshakes and photographs that would never be publicly released. The citation was classified, the details redacted, just a date and a location and vague language about exceptional service under difficult circumstances. The medal went into a drawer with the others when he finally got home, bronze and silver discs on colored ribbons, tokens of moments he'd rather forget. But he kept one of the flare casings, the red one he'd fired that first night when desperation overcame caution. It sat on his desk in his apartment, a reminder that when all the technology fails, when the systems break down and the radios go silent, the human impulse to communicate remains, to reach out across distance and darkness and say, "I'm here, this is important, please listen." The physical recovery took months. Physical therapy 3 times a week, exercises that made his shoulder ache and burn, gradual progression from simple movements to full functionality. His daughter called once, prompted by her mother who'd been contacted by someone official and told there'd been an incident, but her ex-husband was fine. The conversation was awkward, filled with pauses and unspoken questions. She asked if he was okay, and he said yes, which was true enough. She asked what happened, and he said he couldn't talk about it, which was also true. She said she was glad he wasn't hurt worse, and he heard genuine relief in her voice, which surprised him. Maybe the distance between them wasn't as complete as he'd thought. Maybe there was still something there worth salvaging. He thought about that a lot during recovery, during the long days when he couldn't work and couldn't do much of anything except sit and think. He'd spent 20 years putting the mission first, putting duty above everything. And what had it gotten him? A collection of medals in a drawer, scars physical and otherwise, and a family he barely knew. The contracting work paid well, but money couldn't fill the empty spaces, couldn't give back the years he'd lost, couldn't repair the relationships he'd neglected. When he was finally cleared for work again, he turned down the next contract offer, and the one after that. He called his daughter instead, asked if he could visit. Actually visit, not just send money and cards. She said yes, sounded cautiously pleased, and he bought a plane ticket to California for the following week. He didn't know if it was too late, didn't know if the damage could be repaired, but he knew he had to try. Had to make the same kind of desperate effort he'd made in that valley, sending signals into darkness and hoping someone would see. The war continued without him, as wars do. New conflicts, new crises, new soldiers and contractors sent to distant places to do difficult things. He followed the news sometimes, recognized patterns and tactics, understood the context in a way civilians never could, but he wasn't part of it anymore. He'd done his time, paid his dues, and earned the right to step back. Sometimes, on clear evenings, he'd stand outside and look up at the stars, and remember what it felt like to send light into darkness with no certainty it would be seen. That leap of faith required in the moment between firing a flare and waiting for a response. The profound human need to be heard, to matter, to make a difference even when surrounded by chaos and impossibility. He'd been alone in those mountains, cut off from everything, and he'd found a way to communicate anyway. Had refused to accept silence, had kept trying until someone understood. That same determination, he thought, could apply to other things, to rebuilding relationships, to being present instead of absent, to making his life mean something beyond missions and medals. It wouldn't be easy, nothing worthwhile ever was, but he'd faced worse odds and survived. He'd sent signals from behind enemy lines and changed the course of a war. Surely he could figure out how to talk to his own daughter, how to be a father instead of a ghost. The flare casing stayed on his desk, a reminder and a promise. A reminder of what desperation and determination could accomplish. A promise to himself that he'd keep trying, keep reaching out, keep sending signals into the darkness. Because in the end, that's what the story was about. Not the tactics or the military hardware, not the firefights or the narrow escapes, but the fundamental truth that connection is survival, that isolation is the real enemy, that one person, armed with nothing but determination and creativity, can change the course of events by refusing to accept silence. The radio died in enemy territory, but Marcus Hale did not. And in the space between those two facts, everything changed.